This is Mike Hayslip, your host for this segment of Garland Perspectives, a series of visits with some of the special folks who've contributed to Garland's growth and development. These visits are sponsored by the Garland Sesquicentennial Commission in celebration of our state's 150th anniversary in 1986. Our guest here in the Store Cable studio today is Mary White Lee, born December 15th, 1897, in Kings Mountain, North Carolina. Her father, John F. White, a school teacher, merchant, and bookkeeper, had come to Garland in 1895 and married Lillian Cole, daughter of the minister at First Christian Church here. Ms. Cole's grandfather, W.B. Cole, was a circuit rider who was the first to preach at First Christian. Mrs. White's parents reared, Mr. White rather, parents reared him in Clover County, South Carolina, and Mrs. Lee and her family returned here to Garland in 1910. She was one of 8 children and graduated from Garland schools in 1915. She then attended Denton Teachers College, now North Texas State University, where she roomed with the granddaughter of Dr. K.H. Embry, namesake of one of the early townships from which Garland was formed. Later, she attended the Shamburger Business College in Dallas. Her first job was with the Hudson Davis Company, later Cole and Davis Company, on the square in Garland, where she started in 1917. There were 18 stores in the Hudson Davis chain then in Texas, and Mrs. Lee not only kept books, but served as cashier, secretary, sales lady, and buyer. In her spare time, she assisted in running a hem-stitch machine as well. In 1934, she married John B. Lee, and together they bought, renovated, and sold homes. Mr. Lee left us in 1966. We're glad to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Why is it that your family came to Garland?
I think that my father came because he was listening to Mr. Greeley go west and make your fortune. I think he thought he'd make his fortune out here. He did when he married my mother.
So that was the best thing
That
you think he did?
was the best thing that ever happened to him.
So he came to Garland and married, but did not stay the first time.
Oh.
He returned home. Why do you suppose he did that?
His brother-in-law was a doctor in Kings Mountain, and he needed a pharmacist in his drugstore. And my father went back and became the pharmacist of that drugstore.
And stayed there until he returned to Garland.
Mm-hmm.
Wonder why they came back to Garland in 1910.
Well, now, we went to Eufaula, Alabama first.
Okay.
We were there 5 years.
Okay.
And my father was with the mills, cotton mills. And the cotton mills that he was with at that time was sold to the state of Alabama, and it was changed. And so my father came to Texas in 1910.
What are your earliest memories of Garland, if you had to form a mental picture?
The worst thing, I think, was that we had plank walks, dirt roads, no plumbing, indoor plumbing, all outdoor plumbing, no waterworks. We had kerosene lamps. Why we came to Texas to all of that when we'd been used to all those conveniences, I couldn't understand.
But you stayed.
But we stayed.
Why was that?
Well, because our grandparents, our family was here, my mother was happy here, and my father had gone into business. He had become the manager and part owner of the Garland Hardware and Furniture Company.
I see. So he found his niche here in Garland.
Yes.
And you stayed there. You, while you weren't born here, you did go to school here, and you were a member of a notorious graduating class of 1915, I believe. You would have been in Garland schools 5 years approximately at that time. What do you remember about the Garland schools?
Well, I didn't tell you the other night, but Clay Olinger and I were desk mates.
You shared a desk?
We shared a desk, yes.
Okay.
And so Miss Jenny Camp was our teacher at that time. and we had a library in connection with the room, and we persuaded her to let us sit in the library because we could study better in there.
Did you study?
No.
What did you do?
We were always pulling pranks.
What sort of pranks?
Well, one thing that we got a rubber snake and put it in among the books. And when somebody would come in to get a book, that snake would crawl out.
Well, now, were you always that serious about your studies there?
I think that's really the only prank we ever pulled.
So you got away into the library. Tell me, what do you remember physically about the building itself, the school building? Now, I trust that we are dealing with a building that was between Avenue A and Avenue B and 9th and 10th Street.
It's right across the street from, it's the same building, I mean the same location that the building is, where the building is now,
okay, so,
across from the Methodist Church.
Okay, across from First Methodist. What do you remember about that school?
Well, it was wonderful, I know that. We had a good time. It never was hard. My best friends were in my class.
Okay.
And we were about 19 of us, and we were all very close. When we had parties, we all went in a group. And of course, we walked. We didn't have a way of riding.
Right.
And we didn't have to because Garland was just 870 people.
Right.
That's all that there's population of Garland at that time.
Okay. What sort of subjects do you recall taking in that?
Well, our best teacher was Mr. Lloyd, S.M. Lloyd, and he taught English, and he was the best English teacher that I have ever known, because we could have finished right there and never gone to college and could speak the better English than some of the graduates of colleges do now.
Now you're going to make me nervous.
That's right. That's
So,
true.
Do you remember any elocution classes or what sort of English work did you do?
Well, it's just the regular in the high schools at that time. No, we didn't go that far.
How long was a school day then? Do you recall? Was it a longer or a shorter day than it is now?
I don't remember.
Okay, and you
I don't remember whether we went home to lunch and went back or not. I don't
you had
remember.
no cafeteria, did you?
No.
You didn't have
No.
You didn't have hot meals served. Did
No.
You had drinking fountains?
I don't remember. I doubt it. I doubt it.
You had a bucket?
I'll tell you something funny about the bucket. At home, my father every night would draw a bucket of water from the well. We had a deep well. Mm-hmm. And we had these, in our kitchen, we had a place to keep this well, this bucket of water, and it had a dipper in it. And we had a crowd of children, you know. But he would put that fresh every night. And during the night, if we wanted to drink water, we'd go in and each one would drink out of the dipper. Everybody drank out of the dipper. I'm 88 years old, so it didn't hurt me.
We'd be afraid to do that now,
Yeah,
wouldn't we?
that's right.
We'd have the health authorities down on us and all the rest of it. What was discipline like in the school?
Mr. Lloyd was very strict. If we failed in one subject, I don't mean failed, but I mean if we couldn't answer him exactly, he told me one time, says, you ought to have your head cut off, put in the trash pile.
I wonder what the psychologists would have to say about that.
Well, I don't know that. I don't think they wouldn't agree with that today.
And yet he stands out as one of the best teachers.
He was one of the best teachers in that school has ever had.
Well, what would happen in the case of fights or ruckus breaking loose?
We didn't fight. We didn't have those things in school then.
Okay. Or when they did it, they got out of your sight.
I didn't know anything about it if they did.
And then you went on after high school here to the Denton Teachers College.
I believe it's called Denton Normal.
Okay, which is now North Texas State. Mm-hmm. Why did you do that? Was it very usual to go to college then? Or?
Well, my father was a teacher, and he had 4 sisters, and they all were school teachers. And he didn't think that it was right for young ladies to do anything but teach school. And so he wanted me to prepare to be a teacher. And that's the reason I went.
To take care of people that put rubber snakes in the book.
Why, sure.
So you went to Denton Normal, and what did you discover when you got there?
I discovered I didn't want to be a school teacher, that I wanted to be a bookkeeper.
No snakes in those
No,
books.
that's right.
Okay. And so then you went to Shamburger Business College. What sort of courses did you take there?
Well, I had business, English, and reading, spelling, and shorthand and typing.
How long did the course take?
I believe it was 3 months.
Okay. And with that, you got out and you sailed into the world with your first job, right? Mm-hmm. Now, had you ever worked part-time before? Or?
Yes, I had worked after school and on Saturdays at the Hudson Davis stores, which the stores were organized in 1895.
Okay, now this was a dry goods operation
store,
for the
Hudson
benefit
Davis Dry Goods.
of those who don't remember that. And you went to work on the square in Garland in 1917, I believe you told us. At what point? Where was the store?
It was where the theater is now, is on the north side next to H.W. Jones.
Okay, so it was on the northwest corner of the
Yes.
square. What sort of things did you all sell in the store back
With
then?
all dry goods, all kinds of dry goods.
But can you mention some things maybe we wouldn't be accustomed to finding in a normal department store, let's say today? Did you sell button shoes, for example?
Oh yes, oh yes. We had all kinds of shoes and dry goods and
Well, dry good is...
patterns. We sold patterns then. We had just about everything.
Now, there's a
that you
lot of
needed.
sewing going on, of course, in the
Yes.
homes then, but
One interesting thing, every Saturday, the women that lived in the country would come to town, and this store had stools along the counter on the outside, and they would come in and sit on the stool. We had to stand, the clerks did, but they'd always come in and get a seat on one of those stools and sit there.
did they ever gossip?
Oh yes, that's where the gossiping went on.
So that then became not only a store and a place for you to work, but it was one of the points of social exchange
yeah.
in the town. And these people, I take it, were out on the farms and had no opportunity to talk with anyone other than in their own family, and there wasn't much any way they could get news or exchange news that way, so they would come in. Was that what was called a Trader's Day? Or
We did have Traders Day every Monday. I believe it was on Monday
okay.
or Saturday. I've forgotten which.
But
We had one day a week was Traders Day.
what would be done with the children in the stores back then when the women would come in to visit?
Oh, they brought their children with them.
Where did they stay during
They
the
just
time?
played around.
Was that ever a problem?
Never, never.
Did you carry a
You know, children weren't spoiled like they are now.
did you carry any accounts? Could you
yeah.
take a master charge card or
We
something?
didn't have that. We just had accounts, and I handled them.
What did you do when somebody got behind?
Went after them to collect it.
Okay. I believe you explained to me the other night some sort of cash handling system in that store that I
We
found
did,
unusual.
and I haven't been able to remember just what we called it. But my office was in the balcony,
Okay.
and there was a wire that went from the downstairs to the balcony, and there was a little cup on it. And you pulled a cord, you put your ticket, sales ticket, and your cash, whatever, in that cup. Pulled the cord, and it went up to me, and I made the change, checked the ticket with the change, and made the change, and sent it back. And if it's a
So
credit,
you just strung it over the side there.
it would come up to me and then lock. I'd take it out, and I'd slip it back up in that cup, like the cup in that apparatus, turn it loose, and it'd go back down. I don't know what it was called, but it was unique.
I can imagine it was. Back to my original line that I was trying to follow. You've told us about studying. You've told us about working and what you did there. What did you do for recreation and fun back in those days?
We had parties in the different homes,
A lot of hooping and hollering.
but we worked. We had to work.
Well, When you weren't working, though, on the weekends or in the evenings, you would have parties in private homes. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Was there any other place to have a party in Garland back then?
No, we had all the parties were in the homes.
What did the churches do as far as the recreational aspect? Did they ever have a sort of a meeting or a gathering that could be used?
Well, in our church we had the Christian Endeavor.
That doesn't sound very recreational.
But that wasn't recreational. No,
Okay.
that was educational.
Okay. So you had private parties in homes.
Yes.
What did you do in those?
I'll tell you one person that always had the class at their home is Miss Peter Hanley. She was a great hostess.
I see.
And I think she always entertained the different classes. And
Had the
then
entire class in one home.
And Miss Jenny Camp had us out here at her home. That was the graduating class. And Actress Jackson had us out his home. And different ones would have them in their homes. And we all went together. We didn't date off separately. We just did some groups.
What sort of a curfew or time did you have where you had to come in?
Oh, we got in by 10 o'clock at night.
All right.
Oh, yes.
So you didn't have a problem with staying out late?
No.
And you went to these...
We didn't have problems like they have today, fortunately.
I wonder why.
Probably because way we were reared.
Yeah.
Of course, we didn't have the problem with drinking in those days. As far as I know, we didn't. I didn't know about it if we did. But the way we were reared, we didn't want that kind of entertainment.
What did you do at the parties? What was going on at the parties?
Well, we played spin the plate, things like that.
What is spin the plate?
I don't know that I remember too much about it, but I know we'd spin the plate and somebody would grab it. But then we changed seats. What do you call it?
Musical chairs?
Musical chairs. That was one of our games. And at home, we played dominoes. That was our... And our yard game was croquet.
Okay.
In those days.
There was a lot of croquet being played in Garland.
A lot. We always had a croquet set in our yard.
You remember the fairgrounds in Garland, down near First Street?
You mean down the park?
Well, there was whether you want to call it a park or a fairground, I'm talking about in the early years that would have been down toward First Street and Avenue D. Were you ever allowed to go down around the fairgrounds down there? I understand there were some horse races down there, so you might not have wanted to frequent that sort of an area.
No, my mother was a lover of horses, but she didn't care for the races. No, she just loved to ride them.
Okay. Did you participate in any sort of team sports back then? Garland's a big team town now.
No, I never did play basketball or anything like that.
Okay.
I was small.
I know how you feel.
That's right.
So you didn't get involved in that. One of the things you have gotten involved in, and you did it almost by birth, you inherited the involvement in it, is religious activities. And I know the church has always played a big part in your life. Yes. You're the granddaughter and the great-granddaughter of ministers. What are your early recollections about your church work and your life in the church?
Well, I remember in 1910 when we came, soon after we came here, we had an evangelist, John W. Marshall from Chicago, came and held a meeting in our church.
Okay, that would have been the first Christian church.
First Christian church. And he had charts. He preached from charts. He drew, one sermon he preached, I remember, was Faith, Hope, and Love. And he drew a steeple, and the base was faith, and the center was hope, and love was at the top of the temple.
Do you realize that this man preached a sermon you've remembered for 75 years?
Yes.
Isn't that...
It was marvelous. I remembered sermons.
So he used visual illustrations.
Yes.
And wouldn't that thrill a minister nowadays to know that something he said in a service would be remembered?
I can tell you one better than that. In the 1920s, when George Dickinson was pastor of our church.
Right.
He preached a sermon on the art gallery of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sitting right up at the front. I always sat at the front and heard
I
everything.
always sat at the back.
I sat at the front and I heard everything he said. So I went home and I was telling my mother that about it. And I said, I wish I had an outline of that sermon. And I found it in the Lookout, one of our periodicals that my grandmother had kept. That was in the 1920s.
Right.
And so she found out I was interested in it, and she gave it to me. And so I wrote that sermon, the Art Gallery of the Bible, and I have it. And I've given it twice at the Women's Club and at the Baptist Church and the Methodist Church meeting.
So
The Art Gallery of the Bible, which George Dickinson preached in 1926.
Was there much interchange in services in those years, like going to services of a church other than your own?
Oh yes, we always met together, and if we other churches had something, we in the afternoon, the young people would all meet in the other churches with others. Very, very good about that.
So there was
no
not
strife.
any antagonism?
Never.
So what were the churches then? You would have had a Baptist church?
We had the Antioch Baptist and the First Baptist. The Antioch Baptist was on the street back of where the First Baptist was where the Baptist is now.
Right.
Antioch was Baptist, so that was back of that. Then next to that was the Presbyterian Church on down the street, and then the Methodist, and then the Christian, all in a row.
Right, so you had four.
Yeah, I had four churches.
But you had no other?
Oh, that's five.
Yeah, that's right. That's
five
right.
churches.
Two Baptist churches, that makes five. Baptists have always been strong in Garland.
Yes.
So they had two, and everybody else.
Well, at that time, the Christian church was the strongest in membership.
Okay.
At that time.
Okay.
But it's not that way now. But in those days, I think one reason was because my grandfather was so popular. That's what they tell me.
The preacher makes a lot of difference in
They said everybody in town loved him.
Preacher makes a lot of difference in the amount of people that come and probably in the collections that they have. That Christian church that you attended in those early years was a wooden building, and you brought us a picture of that to show. I believe it wasn't always located where it is now, would you?
It was located in about Kingsley and either Shiloh or Jupiter, that area. Okay. And the main street to Dallas was Jupiter, and it was a dirt road. And they brought that little building. It was just a single building, one room. They used it for a schoolroom too.
So they got use out of the building all week long.
Oh yes. And when they moved it to Garland, they brought it on logs. I don't know, anyway, it was driven by mules. And this little building was on that, and they crossed the creek, Duck Creek, down near where White's cafeteria is.
So they had to get the entire building across Duck Creek.
Yes, and my aunt, Mrs. Stevens, was a little girl, and she sat on the bank and watched them bring it across. I've heard her tell about it.
How big was the building that they brought across Duck Creek?
Well, it was the center part of that building that you have a picture of.
Okay.
Didn't have the two side, they added that, two additions to it.
Okay.
After they moved it.
So they added that later.
And the baptistry, an interesting part about it, the baptistry was underneath the floor. And when they had a baptism, they had to remove the pulpit and take up the planks, and then they had steps down into the water. And what they did in the wintertime, I don't know, because there wasn't any way of warming it.
Well, it may be that growth may have slowed during the cold months.
I was baptized there.
In the winter or the summer?
In the summer, July.
See? Yeah. You knew how to choose it. What are the biggest changes you see taking place in the churches in Garland? Now, you've had 75 years where you've been very close to church life.
Well, of course, the population has grown in Garland.
So there are more of them.
Naturally, the churches have grown too. I think the Baptist has grown more, and the Church of Christ, those two churches have really grown more than the others have. And I think the minister has a great deal to do with it. with the growth of the church. I'd say that because my grandfather was a minister, my great-grandfather, and also my great-great-grandfather, Sweet, from Illinois, was a minister.
Right.
So I came from a rich heritage of Christian ministers.
Is that anything like being a preacher's kid, being a preacher's grandkid? Do you think that ever gave you any?
You know, I wondered why they said that about preachers' children, but I can't believe my mother was ever a bad child.
Your mother, I remember very well, and she had a very fun-loving gleam in her
Yes.
eyes. I also remember your grandmother, not as clearly as I remember your mother, but I always had the impression your mother saw a joke in a lot of things that kept her going and had good humor about her. I remember that very well.
I remember one thing that Ms. A.R. Davis said about my mother. They were very close friends. Mm-hmm. And she said to me one day, she says, "Your mother is more like an angel than anybody I know." I appreciated that.
I know you must have. What was the physical health of the town like in those early days? What happened when you got sick?
We had a very good doctor, Dr. J. Chogle. Mm-hmm. He brought my brother, the first child in my family, my brother. He brought him into the world. And he was still here when my last two brothers and sister came, and he brought them into the world. All of us were brought at home, were born at home, none of us in the hospital. In North Carolina, my uncle was a doctor, and he was the doctor that brought us into the world.
What do you remember about sicknesses and whatnot? Do you remember people being generally healthy or having a lot of ailments or?
Well, in 1918, during the flu epidemic, my brother was in the Navy, in the Great Lakes Station, Naval Station training. And everybody, all the men went down with the flu. My brother had the flu. And his the roommate, one closest to him, died. And my brother came through it. And that was the only time he was ever sick in his life. He never missed a day from work, as long as until he retired. And after he retired, he died of cancer. But he was never away from work one day, account of illness.
You come from a very long-lived family in many cases.
Mm-hmm. Yes. My grandmother lived to be almost 99. My mother was 93. And my aunt, Mrs. A.W. Lander, was 104. Mm-hmm. So
you come from a very healthy family, too. What do you remember besides the flu epidemic in 1918 in terms of health? Or do you remember anything about the medications or any? Well,
in 1926, I had typhoid fever.
Okay.
And in those days, they treated typhoid fever by starving you. Remember they gave me buttermilk, and that's all I had.
For how long?
I don't remember. I know for 10 days my temperature stayed around 105. Mm-hmm. And I was at home. My mother nursed me in the daytime, and we had a trained nurse, Miss Van Arsdale, was the nurse that nursed me at night.
Was he the father of the lady who was?
Dr. Ogle's wife's sister, Miss Fanny Van Arsdale was.
Okay. Well, now, Mr. Van Arsdale, was her father, or was he? Did you say Mr. or Miss was a trained nurse?
Miss Annie Van Arsdale.
I misunderstood you. Okay. Was just trying to probe there. I thought I might have learned something else I didn't know. You lived through the tornado that hit Garland in 1927, and you have shared with us from your files a copy of the Garland News from reporting that event. What do you recall about that, which certainly affected the health and welfare of the community?
Well, I remember that when it happened, that cyclone took the chimney off our house. It was a two-story house.
Now, that house was located at, I believe,
what's now Garland Road and 11th Street, on the corner.
Okay.
It's a two-story house.
And it would have been the southwest quadrant of Garland Avenue and 11th Street. And it took the chimney off.
took the chimney, and those bricks rolling down on that roof sounded like the house was, and of course the cyclone, you know how it sounds like a freight train.
I really
over.
don't, and I'm glad.
Well, it did. That's what it sounded like, freight train. Well, we all got up, and the ones upstairs came downstairs, you know, and we stayed up until we heard what had happened. And the boys, my mother had boarders, and all of the men who stayed in the house went down to help with the wounded. And I also went and helped the doctors with the children.
Mm-hmm. What you recall then is a cooperative effort of everybody in town.
Yes, great, wonderful.
Okay.
That is a wonderful part about Garland. Everybody helped everybody else.
You were also involved, in addition to church work and working for a living. You've also done some work in civic and service clubs here over the years, haven't you? And charity work.
No, I didn't, because I was working. But the only club I belong to and still do is the Women's Study Club.
Okay. What do you recall about the Women's Study Club and your activities in that? How long have you been?
I've been in it since 1971.
Mm-hmm. So
my mother and my Aunt Mrs. G.L. Davis and Mrs. Stevens were members in that. Ms. Davis was a charter member. Mm-hmm. And the others were members, and after they became too old to participate in anything, well, even it was after they were gone. Mm-hmm. My mother died in '69, and Mrs. Davis in '71, and Mrs. Stevens in '73. So then they asked me to come into the club. Okay.
We got you to your first job, and then we wandered off. So let's go beyond that. After you were a cashier in Hudson Davis, what have been your other business and work pursuits?
Ford Motor Company, Ford dealers. I worked for Carl Brown. And
in Garland?
I worked for him. I went to work for Carl Brown in 1922. And I worked there until 1930.
And then?
And then I went to Fort Worth and was with Hub Diggs Ford dealer 1 year. And I came back to crop production loan in Dallas. They just when it started, I was one of the first ones hired.
Tell us what crop production loan was.
It was making loans to farmers. That year the farmers were in as bad shape as they are now, I think. And they needed money.
And this is in 1930?
1931.
Okay.
1931.
And that money came from where?
The government. It was the government.
Okay, so you worked for the government then?
Yes, for 31, 32, 33, and 34.
What sorts of loans or types of people did they work with that were any different from a bank or would work with?
Very much like a bank, very much. And I had charge of the mailing department. And it didn't sound important, but every loan that came through my department, we had to check everything before it went out.
It would have been important if you were waiting for the money, wouldn't it?
Yes, that's right.
So you worked with that?
I had charge of that department.
Until when?
34, when I married.
Ah, you married, you were in Garland when you married
Yes.
then? Okay.
Mm-hmm. I married at home.
And you and Mr. Lee, I believe, were involved in buying, renovating, and selling houses for a number of years. Mm-hmm. You were telling me about that a little bit earlier. I believe you did a good bit of the work yourselves on those things.
Yes, we did. When we would, however, he went to work for Convair in Fort Worth. He was there, I guess, 20 years with Convair until he retired.
But you continued to buy and renovate
yes. Mm-hmm.
and sell homes.
Mm-hmm.
Looking back on it, what would you have done differently about that operation if you...
Nothing. I loved it. And the last house that we worked on, one summer I said, you know, I think we ought to buy another house and start working on it. I'm getting restless.
What do you remember about government services in Garland, such as fire, police, law and order, that sort of thing in Garland? You remember when we had a volunteer fire department?
Well, I'm sure we had one. I don't remember much
You were
about
lucky
that.
enough not to need it then.
No. I don't remember of any fires in Garland after I came here. Of course, they had the big fire in
Oh, yes.
1889.
Yeah, but that's before your
Yes,
time.
that was before my time.
When you came here. But you did come before we had water and sewer service.
Oh, yes.
You-
Oh, yes.
And you did come while we still had wooden sidewalks. How does the square look to you today compared to those?
To then,
Yeah.
quite different. However, the buildings were, my father was in the Garland Hardware and Furniture where Baker is now.
Right.
And
That would be
it
on
was
the south side of the square.
It was a two-story building at that time. So that hadn't changed too much.
Didn't they have a meeting hall in the second floor of that at one time?
No, they had the meeting hall in the second story of where Dyer Drugstore used to be.
Okay, but we're still on the south side of the square.
That's
I'm trying to peg it for
on the
people
south
that...
side of the street. Well, M.D. Williams has his grocery store, and his I guess he had his funeral home in there too.
Whatever you needed,
Yes, whatever you needed, it was there.
you could be taken care of
Yeah.
there. What do you remember about transportation? You started by telling us you had to do a lot of walking, and if you were downtown, the walking had to be on wooden planks, and that there was mud all over the square. Transportation's always been an issue for people in Garland, how to get in and out of town, particularly to Dallas. What do you recall about
You mean
mode?
the early days?
Sure.
Well, we didn't go in the early days on train. We had to go on train.
Do you remember
In the
what
early
train
days.
fare was?
Santa Fe and the Katy.
But what the fare was,
No.
say to Dallas?
No, I don't remember, but I can tell you what when I went to North Carolina, I can tell you what it cost to go there.
You made a trip back to North
Yes.
Carolina.
In 1917, I went to North Carolina, and my ticket was $32.40 round trip.
$32.40 round trip.
Yeah. To Kings Mountain, North Carolina.
That was a lot of money.
Yes, it
back
was.
then.
It was. Mr. T.N. Hickman was the president of the Citizens Bank at that time,
Okay.
and my banker.
All right.
And when I went to him to get the money out to buy my ticket, he said, "Well, you'll need more money than this." I said, "Oh, no, I won't. We're going to ride in a chair car, and we're taking our lunch. That's all the money I need,
You rode all the way to North Carolina
in a chair car."
with a lunch pail,
Yeah.
so you wouldn't have
Yeah,
to.
that's right.
And you filled the lunch pail on the other end, I guess, and rode all the way back the same way?
Well, I had some money when I came back.
Okay. Okay. It was a successful trip. You ever ride in a jitney?
Yes.
Cars that went?
Yes, I've ridden in a jitney. Mhm.
Okay, back and forth. Do you remember the first time you owned a car?
I didn't own a car till after I married.
Okay. When was the first time your family owned a car in Garland?
I don't remember what the year that my father bought. I know I learned to drive a car when I was 15, and our own car.
Okay, so you know you had one before.
Because I drove a car 70 years. I quit driving when I was 85, and I had only paid a $3 fine in those 70 years.
What did you do to be so careless?
I ran a red light, signal light.
Well, when was that?
That was in Grand Prairie.
I bet you remember the date, time, and place on that $3.
Well, I went right straight to the little courthouse in Grand Prairie and paid it because I was on my way home in Fort Worth. That's when we lived in Fort Worth. And that was about 1955, somewhere along 1950.
What do you remember about roads in Garland and streets other than...
Muddy. When my father came to Texas, he started out wanting to bring Garland up to what he was used to. And the first thing he did was start a fund to build sidewalks, concrete sidewalks. And that was the first project when he was mayor in 1911. And then they started on the gravel streets, the square first. And then he began on the waterworks and the sewerage.
Just little by little?
Little by little. He was very active in all of those projects.
In your chance to look back over the people you've known in Garland through the years, I'm sure there are 2 or 3 or 4 that stand out to you as significant in the life of Garland, whether it's the business life or the civic life or the church life in Garland. Who might some of those people be, if you had to mention them?
Well, of course, the men I worked with were always wonderful men to me. G.L. Davis, E.G. Cole, both of them my uncles. And Mr. Carl Brown, I worked for him for several years, and he was a marvelous man to work for. Mm-hmm. And then the other men who had the Ford dealership after him, Mr. Will Locke, everybody I worked for were wonderful men. Wonderful men.
You have a tremendous attitude as an employee. There are people who would be looking for you with that kind of an attitude.
Well, I never had any trouble getting a job.
I can believe it, with that sort of an attitude. Why do you think...
Well, I want to tell you about my job in Ennis.
Oh.
You'd like to hear that?
Go right ahead.
My uncle, Mr. Cole, E.G. Cole, had a store, Cole Dry Goods, in Ennis, Texas. And he sent me down there to take charge of the office. They paid me $75 a month salary, and my board and room was $50. I had $25 a month left to live on.
That was for nightlife and whatever.
Yeah,
whatever
everything. Church dues and
church
money,
dues
and money what I gave to the church offering, and I always gave to the church. I always did. You know, I'll tell you right now that Mr. Lee and I had problems, money problems, until we went down and talked to Mr. Arthur Everett in Dallas, and he told us the thing to do was to tithe.
Now, is that the jeweler?
Jeweler, Arthur Everett. We came home and sat down and figured just exactly what we should give. We never had any money problems from that day on, and I still more than tithe my income, my gross income.
What do you see as the biggest changes in Garland since 1910, if you had to spot 2 or 3 things that really stand out to you?
Of course, it's the population.
Yeah.
From 870 people to about 175,000.
Okay.
That's
population
the
growth.
Biggest change, I think.
You think
there
that's good?
There hasn't been very much change in the square.
It's still where it was.
Years. It's still the square.
Do you think
it's improved? It's more. It's better. Looks better, but it's the same square.
Do you think that population growth's been good?
I'd rather it wouldn't be so large.
Okay. You liked it better when you could get around it?
I get lost in Garland now.
And you could know some more
Yeah.
people. What are the things you're proudest of in your years here, having something to do with?
Well, I am proudest of the way we were reared in my family. That's
Okay.
my parents,
Okay.
my grandparents, the way we were reared.
Have you got any regrets?
No.
No regrets?
No regrets.
What sort of advice would you give younger people planning to come to or already in Garland about things they ought to do as far as their lives in the community?
Being like I am, I'd say get interested in church first. You meet the best people in the church.
Okay.
That's the best place to go to get acquainted.
All right.
Get involved in the church. That's the first thing you should do.
Garland has always been a town strong on that as a community. Anything else that you would have to say?
Well, take part in the civic.
You believe in involvement?
Yes, I do. I believe in involving yourself in anything for the betterment of your town.
Well, that's pretty clear, because I think that's the way you've played the game always, ever since you've been here. And now looking back on it, that's the same thing you would suggest for somebody else as well.
Yeah.
What are your plans for the future? Every time I talk to you, you're on some kind of project. You're only 88. You come from a group of people that lives a long time. What are your plans? I know you're working on a family history.
Well, I'm working on that now, yes. Mm-hmm.
You always got a project.
Always have a project.
Well, that's good. We really do appreciate your taking the time to be with us today. Our time is almost up. We appreciate the contributions that you made where you've been in the city, It's going to be up to us now to ponder some of the things you've had to say and see how we can incorporate those things into our own work to help move Garland forward. So for this segment of Garland Perspectives, so long. Thank you. Now you see.